Hello everyone, and welcome back. There is a particular kind of stillness that comes over you when you are looking at something very old. Not studying it, not analyzing it, just looking. A letter written in faded ink, a photograph with soft edges and unfamiliar faces, a hand-drawn map on a piece of paper that has been folded and unfolded so many times that the creases have become part of the image itself. Dark lines running across cities and oceans like cracks in old porcelain. Something in that moment asks you to slow down, to stay with it a little longer than you planned. Most of us have had that feeling at some point. You pick up something old, and without quite deciding to, you find yourself quieter than you were a moment before. The pace of the room changes. The ordinary world outside the window becomes a little more distant, and whatever is in your hands begins to feel like it matters, in a way that is hard to name precisely. It was something like that feeling that first drew serious attention to medieval maps. Not the famous ones preserved behind climate-controlled glass in great museums, but the working copies. The ones made not for display but for use, by monks and scholars and educated pilgrims who needed to understand, in some visual form, how the world was arranged. These maps were drawn on parchment, which is animal skin that has been scraped and dried until it is thin enough to write on. They were inked with tools made from the feathers of large birds. They were painted in colors ground from minerals and plants, and sometimes from materials whose sources we are still not entirely sure about. They were made with great care and considerable skill, by people who were educated and serious and entirely committed to the task of representing the world as accurately as they understood it. And by any standard we would apply today, they were wrong in almost every way that a map can be wrong. Continents are misshapen. Distances are wildly inaccurate. Coastlines bend in directions they do not actually bend. The relative positions of cities and mountains and rivers reflect not surveyed reality, but inherited description, passed from scholar to scholar across centuries of copying. And yet, there is something in these maps that rewards more than a quick glance. Not despite their inaccuracies, but because of one particular kind of inaccuracy that appears on nearly all of them. Because at the edge of every medieval map, in the regions where the coastlines grew uncertain and the place names thinned out and finally disappeared, the mapmakers did not leave empty space. They did not write a note in the margin admitting that the world continued beyond what they knew. Instead, they drew figures, strange ones, beings that stood upright like people, but did not look like any person the mapmaker had ever seen or heard credibly described by anyone who had actually traveled there. And among the strangest of these figures, appearing again and again across centuries and across different map-making traditions and different languages and different theological frameworks, were the Blemmyae. People, if that word can be applied here with any comfort, who had no heads at all. Their eyes were set into their shoulders, their mouths were curved across their chests, and they were placed on the maps not tentatively, not apologetically, but with the same calm, deliberate confidence as the city of Rome or the course of the Nile. For more than 1,000 years, across dozens of cultures and hundreds of maps and thousands of manuscript copies, almost no one thought to question them in any serious or sustained way. Tonight, we are going to follow those figures across the parchment. We are going to trace where they came from, how they traveled through time and text, what purpose they served in the maps that carried them, and what their long, quiet persistence at the edges of human geography tells us about something that has not changed very much at all. the profound discomfort of not knowing what lies just beyond the reach of the familiar, and what people have always been willing to put there in the absence of actual knowledge. If you are settling in for the evening, you are welcome to get comfortable. There is no urgency to any of this. The pace here is slow and will remain slow. We are going to move through this subject the way you move through something old and carefully made, attending to the details, not hurrying toward an answer that may turn out to be simpler than the question it answers. Because the question behind the Blemmyae is not really about headless people. It is about the shape of the unknown, and how human beings have always needed to give it one. Mappa Mundi and the Order of the World. To understand why the Blemmyae appeared on medieval maps, it helps first to understand what a medieval map actually was. And this requires setting aside, at least for a little while, the assumptions that come from living in a world where maps are tools of precise navigation. Today, a map is expected to answer a specific question. Where is this place relative to that one, and how do I move between them? We expect north to be at the top, distances to be proportional to actual distance, and coastlines to match what a satellite image would show. When a map fails at these things, we say it is a bad map, a wrong map, a map that cannot be trusted. Medieval map makers were not trying to make that kind of map. Many of them were monks working in the scriptoria of monasteries, the dedicated rooms where manuscripts were copied and illustrated by hand. They were scholars of theology and of classical learning, trained to understand the world through the texts they had inherited, rather than through the expeditions they had undertaken. When they sat down to draw the world, they were not producing a tool for navigation. They were producing a picture of how the world was organized according to the most authoritative sources available to them. And those sources were not sailors' reports. They were the writings of ancient scholars and the teachings of the Church. The most complete surviving example of this tradition is the Hereford Mappa Mundi, created around the year 1300 and still preserved in Hereford Cathedral in England. It is a large, circular map, perhaps 5 feet tall, drawn on a single sheet of calfskin. If you were to stand in front of it, the first thing you would notice is that Jerusalem sits at its very center. Not near the center, not roughly in the middle. Precisely at the center, the point around which all other geography is organized. This was not a geographical choice. It was a theological one. Jerusalem was understood to be the spiritual center of the world, the place where heaven and earth had most directly intersected in human history, and so it occupied the center of the map. At the very top of the circle, which represented east rather than north in this tradition, sat the Garden of Eden, rendered as a circular island at the outermost edge of the image, paradise placed as far up as the image could reach. At the bottom of the circle, to the west, lay the British Isles and the known edge of the European world. Around the perimeter of this image, in the outer regions where the place names thinned out and the coastlines became approximate and then vague, the map filled with other content. In the sections representing Africa, in the southern and eastern portions of the map's outer ring, figures appeared that had no counterpart in the traveled world of European experience. Among them, carefully rendered in ink and pigment, were the Blemmyae. Small in scale relative to the continents they inhabited, but clear and intentional in their depiction. Their eyes looked outward from their shoulders. Their mouths curved across their chests. They stood in the African regions of the map the way any other people stood in any other region, as the inhabitants of that territory, placed there because that was understood to be where they lived. They were not decorative. They were not ironic. They were placed on the map with the same considered intention as the rivers and the cities and the labeled mountain ranges. and the reasoning behind their placement was, within its own framework, entirely coherent. If Jerusalem was the spiritual center of the world, then distance from Jerusalem was not merely geographical, it was spiritual. The further a place was from the center, the further it was from the divine order that radiated outward from that point, like light from a lamp. The edges of the map were not simply the edges of knowledge, they were the edges of the sacred order itself. And if the center of the world was inhabited by rational, redeemable, spiritually accessible human beings, it followed, with a certain internal logic, that the outermost ring of the world would be inhabited by beings who were, in some way that their bodies reflected, the opposite of that. The Blemmyae were the logical conclusion of the map's own framework. They were not anomalies. They were necessary. This is something worth pausing on, because it is easy to look at a medieval map and see ignorance, to see a failure of knowledge that we have since corrected. What is harder and considerably more useful is to see a system. The people who drew these maps were not naive or uneducated. They were working within a framework of understanding that was internally consistent, that answered the questions it was designed to answer, and that made sense within the community of scholars who shared it. The Hereford Mappa Mundi is not a failed attempt at a modern map. It is a successful attempt at a very different kind of map. One whose purpose was not to help you get from one city to another, but to show you where everything stood in relation to the divine order of creation. Within that purpose, the Blemmyae belonged exactly where they were placed. And they would remain where they were placed until the purpose of maps itself began to change. But before we can understand how they got onto those maps, we need to ask a quieter question. Not what the Blemmyae reveal about the world, what they reveal about the person who first wrote them down. Pliny, Silenus, and the origin of the Headless people. Picture the Bay of Naples in the late summer of the year 79. The water is flat and blue in the morning light. Fishing boats are already out. On the far side of the bay, a mountain sits against the sky the way it always has, its upper slope trailing a thin thread of smoke that no one finds unusual. In a villa near the water, a man is already at his desk before most of the household has woken. His name is Gaius Plinius Secundus. He does not read in silence. He has someone read to him while he writes notes, because reading aloud and annotating simultaneously allows him to work through more material than silence permits. His nephew, who will survive him and later describe his habits, recalls that his uncle considered every moment not spent in study to be wasted. Meals were occasions for reading. Journeys were occasions for dictation. Sleep was kept to the minimum the body required. This is the man who will write the Blemmyae into European history. He is not writing about Africa from experience. He has never been there. He is writing from his library, from a collection of Greek and Roman texts that has taken decades to assemble, from accounts written by people who heard from people who may or may not have been closer to the original source than he is. On his desk this morning, among dozens of other scrolls, is a Greek geographical text describing the peoples of the outer world. He reads it, or has it read to him, and he writes down what it says. No head, eyes in the shoulders, mouth curved across the chest. He does not add a note of uncertainty. He does not write that this comes from a source he cannot verify. He writes it the way he writes the mineral properties of lead or the migration habits of storks, as a fact of the natural world that a thorough account of nature is obligated to record. In a few weeks, the mountain across the bay will erupt. Pliny will sail toward it to observe, and he will not return. But what he wrote that morning, and on 100 mornings like it, will outlast him by more than 15 centuries. The Blemmyae did not appear on medieval maps out of nowhere. They arrived there already carrying more than 1,000 years of written authority, a chain of scholarly endorsement so long and so consistent that questioning them would have felt less like critical thinking and more like questioning the entire tradition of classical learning. To understand how they acquired that authority, it is necessary to stay for a moment in that library by the bay and think about what it means when a careful man writes down something he has never seen. Gaius Plinius Secundus, known to history as Pliny the Elder, was a Roman administrator and scholar of the 1st century of the Common Era. He was a man of extraordinary industry and curiosity, someone who, by his own nephew's account, never stopped working, who read constantly, who had notes taken for him at dinner so that no time would be wasted, who worked by lamplight when others slept. The product of this relentless accumulation of knowledge was the Naturalis Historia, a vast encyclopedia of the natural world that covered astronomy, meteorology, geography, zoology, botany, medicine, metallurgy, and dozens of other subjects. It was the most ambitious reference work of the ancient world, and it remained one of the most consulted texts in Europe for more than 15 centuries after its author died in the eruption of Vesuvius in the year 79. Among the many subjects Pliny addressed in the Naturalis Historia was the geography of the known world and the peoples who inhabited its various regions. He wrote about the peoples of Europe and the Near East with the relative specificity of someone drawing on extensive written and oral sources. He wrote about the peoples of Asia and Africa with a mixture of genuine reported knowledge and inherited tradition. And when he arrived at the furthest reaches of his geographical account, at the regions of Africa that lay beyond the range of direct Roman contact, he drew on a body of Greek geographical writing that was already centuries old by his time. In those sections, he catalogued various peoples of unusual description with the same matter-of-fact confidence he brought to the properties of minerals or the habits of birds. Among them were the Blemmyae, placed in the region he called Ethiopia, which in ancient usage referred not specifically to the modern country, but to a broad region of sub-Saharan Africa about which actual knowledge was limited. He described them as having no heads, with their mouth and eyes attached to their chests. He wrote this without indicating uncertainty. He offered no source. He did not say, "I have been told," or "it is reported," or "some claim that." He recorded it the way he recorded everything else, as a fact of the world that a thorough natural history was obligated to include. After Pliny came a writer named Julius Silenus, working in the 3rd century, who compiled a geographical summary he called the Collectanea Rerum Memorabilium, a collection of notable things worth remembering. Silenus drew heavily and directly from Pliny, and his treatment of the Blemmyae repeated and in some passages elaborated on Pliny's account. Because Silenus was frequently easier to read than Pliny's dense and encyclopedic text, his version of many classical geographical descriptions became the primary reference for later medieval scholars. He was, in effect, Pliny filtered and simplified, and his version of the Blemmyae was often the version that reached the monks who would eventually place them on maps. After Silenus came Isidore of Seville, a bishop and encyclopedist of the 7th century, who produced a reference work called the Etymologiae, an attempt to organize all human knowledge into a single coherent system. In his section on the peoples of the world, Isidore included the Blemmyae alongside dozens of other unusual peoples, all drawn from classical sources, all described with the same level and confident tone. The Etymologiae was one of the most widely copied texts of the medieval period. It was, for many scholars, the first place they looked when they needed to know what the authoritative tradition said about any subject. And what it said about the Blemmyae, drawn from Pliny through Silenus, was that they existed, that they lived in Africa, and that they had no heads. By the time this chain of transmission had run from Pliny through Silenus, through Isidore, and into the scriptoria of medieval Europe, the Blemmyae had been in the written record for something like 800 years. Every copy of every text that mentioned them was an act of endorsement. Every scholar who cited them lent his authority to theirs. In a world where the written word carried enormous weight and where the classical tradition was understood as the repository of the most reliable knowledge available, the Blemmyae had become as solid as the Alps. To question them was not to demonstrate critical thinking. It was to place oneself in opposition to an accumulated body of scholarship that stretched back to the founding texts of Western learning. What Pliny himself was drawing on is much harder to trace. The best scholarly thinking on this is that some genuine observation or some genuine account of a genuine people lies somewhere at the very beginning of the chain, transformed beyond recognition by the processes of translation and retelling. A people who went into battle holding large decorated shields before them, the shields painted with faces, so that from a distance they appeared to have faces on their chests. A culture whose elaborate chest decoration was described by an observer who had no vocabulary in their own language to explain what they were seeing, and who reached for something that would convey the strangeness of it to their audience. A traveler who heard a story secondhand, misunderstood a crucial detail, and passed along a version that the next listener misunderstood in a different direction. The original observation, if there was one, is gone. What survived was its shape after a very long series of transformations. And that shape fit so perfectly into what later traditions expected and needed to find in Africa that it was never seriously questioned. And so the Blemmyae passed from scholar to scholar, from century to century, settling into the maps. But the maps themselves had a logic of their own, a logic that determined not just who lived at the edge of the world, but why they had to be there at all. The hotlands and the logic of climate. Take a medieval map and lay it flat on a table. Look at it not the way you would look at a modern map, searching for a specific place, but the way you would look at a painting, taking in the whole image at once. Notice where the colors change. In many of these maps, the middle band of the world, the broad horizontal strip crossing the African continent below the known Mediterranean regions, is rendered differently from the rest. Sometimes it is painted in warm tones of red and ochre. Sometimes it is left deliberately sparse, with fewer place names, fewer details, as if the mapmaker's knowledge simply ran dry there. Sometimes it carries a brief annotation in careful script, a warning in Latin that this region cannot be crossed, that the heat makes it impossible, that no traveler should expect to pass through and survive. Below that band is where the Blemmyae live. This was not an arbitrary arrangement. The hot zone, the colored barrier at the middle of the world, had a name that came from ancient Greek geography. The torrid zone, meaning the scorched zone, the burned zone. And the peoples who lived south of it were understood, within the logic of that tradition, to be themselves scorched, distorted by their climate, shaped by heat into something that the moderate world of the Mediterranean could not produce. The Blemmyae and their rearranged bodies were, in this framework, the logical result of what extreme heat does to the human form when it acts on it without relief across many generations. There is a question that arises naturally when you look carefully at medieval maps. Why were the strange peoples placed where they were? The Blemmyae appear in Africa. Other unusual peoples appear in the extreme north or at the edge of the Far East. They are not scattered randomly across the image. They occupy specific regions, and those regions have something in common. They are all, in the geographical understanding of the medieval world, places of climatic extremity. To understand this fully, it helps to trace the theory of climate that the medieval world inherited from ancient Greece, because that theory shaped not just the placement of the Blemmyae, but the entire logic of what the edges of the world were expected to contain. The ancient Greeks had developed a model of the inhabited world that divided it into bands based on their relationship to the sun. The word they used for these bands, klimata, gave us the modern word climate. In the temperate zone, which included the Mediterranean world and the regions immediately around it, conditions were understood to be balanced, not too hot, not too cold, neither extreme producing distortion. The people of the temperate zone were, by this reasoning, themselves balanced, moderate in temperament, capable of reason, able to organize themselves into stable political communities, suited to the kind of civic life that Greeks and later Romans understood as the highest expression of human possibility. The cold zones far to the north produced a different kind of person. Cold was understood to strengthen the body, but to slow the mind, to produce people who were physically imposing but lacking in the intellectual refinement that warmth encouraged. The northern peoples were fierce but limited, capable of fighting, but not of the kind of sophisticated governance that defined civilization in the Greek and Roman imagination. And then there were the hot zones. The regions near the equator, which Greek geography called the torrid zone, a name that meant scorched or burned, were understood to be so intensely heated that travel through them was impossible. The sun, in the summer months, passed directly overhead in these regions, and the classical assumption was that nothing could survive that kind of intensity on a sustained basis. These regions appeared on classical geographical diagrams as a band of uninhabitable territory separating the known northern world from whatever might exist to the south. Medieval scholars inherited this model and adapted it to their own geographical and theological frameworks. The torrid zone appeared on medieval maps as a colored band across the middle of Africa, rendered in warm tones, sometimes marked with brief warnings about the impossibility of crossing it. South of that band, in the sections of the map that represented whatever lay beyond the scorched middle region, was where the most extreme peoples lived. The heat that made those regions uninhabitable to ordinary travelers was understood also to have shaped the beings who did somehow live there, distorting their bodies the way extreme conditions distort everything else exposed to them. The Blemmyae, with their rearranged features and missing heads, were the natural inhabitants of a region where nature itself was understood to operate differently. This logic had an additional layer that is worth understanding. In the medieval theological framework, the natural world was understood to reflect the moral and spiritual order of the universe. An extreme environment was not merely a physical condition. It was a spiritual one. Regions that were climatically extreme were spiritually distant from the center of the sacred order, and the beings who inhabited them would, by this reasoning, reflect that distance in their very bodies. The heat of the torrid zone was a physical sign of spiritual peripherality, and the Blemmyae were a physical embodiment of what that peripherality looked like in human form. What this beautifully coherent and entirely enclosed system could not accommodate was the actual geography of sub-Saharan Africa. The kingdoms of Mali, Ghana, Axum, and later Zimbabwe and others were not represented on these maps. Not because they did not exist, they were in many cases large, wealthy, sophisticated, and deeply embedded in long-distance trading networks that connected them to North Africa and through North Africa to the Mediterranean. but because the information about them did not reach European mapmakers through the channels those mapmakers considered authoritative. Trade goods arrived: gold, ivory, salt, cloth. But the geographical and political knowledge that would have allowed a mapmaker to draw the kingdoms that produced those goods remained, from the European perspective, unavailable. And in the absence of that knowledge, the inherited shapes of classical imagination filled the space where Mali and Aksum should have been. What is harder to see, and more worth seeing, is that the map was not just a picture of the world. It was a picture of what the world was permitted to contain. And for the Blemmyae to live on the map for 14 centuries, they first had to be permitted to exist. That permission came from an unexpected place, not from geography and not from science, but from theology. The theology of the strange. Did the Blemmyae have souls? Imagine a monk in the early 5th century, sitting in a scriptorium in North Africa, copying a text by hand. The room is cool in the morning and warm by afternoon. Ink dries quickly in this climate. Outside, the city of Hippo goes about its ordinary business. Markets, arguments, the sound of carts on stone streets. The man copying the text is not the author. He is a student or a junior member of the community, assigned to reproduce the words of someone else so that another copy of the work can exist in another place. But the text he is copying was written by the bishop of this very city. And the passage he is working through now has stopped him, not in his hand, which continues to move across the page, but in his mind. The bishop, whose name is Augustine, has raised a question that the copyist has not considered before. If the Blemmyae exist, if there are truly people in Africa with no heads and eyes in their shoulders, are they descended from Adam? The copyist knows why this matters. He has been trained in theology long enough to understand what depends on the answer. If they are descended from Adam, they have souls, and souls can be saved, and that means someone should go to them. If they are not descended from Adam, they are something else entirely, and the obligations of Christian community do not extend to them. The question is not philosophical in the abstract sense. It has consequences for real people, or for the beings that may or may not be real people, living in the places that maps have marked with figures no one has actually seen. He copies the bishop's answer carefully. Augustine is characteristically cautious. He says that if such peoples exist, they must be descended from Adam. He suggests that some of the reports may simply be mistaken, but he does not dismiss the question. And the copyist, finishing the passage and moving to the next, carries that question with him into the rest of his afternoon. The question of the Blemmyae was never only geographical or natural historical. From an early point in the Christian scholarly tradition, it was also deeply theological, taken seriously enough that one of the most important thinkers in the history of Western Christianity felt the need to address it at some length in one of his most significant works. Aurelius Augustinus, known to history as Augustine of Hippo, was a bishop and philosopher of the late 4th and early 5th centuries whose writings shaped Western Christianity more profoundly than those of almost any other individual. In his great work, The City of God, begun after the sack of Rome in 410 and completed over the course of more than a decade, Augustine addressed a question that might seem, from a modern perspective, to be peripheral to the theological concerns of a monumental work: the question of monstrous peoples and their relationship to humanity. He raised it directly. If monstrous peoples existed, as the classical sources claimed, were they descended from Adam and Eve? This was not a curiosity. It was a problem with serious consequences. Christian theology held that all human beings shared a common origin in the first created pair, and that this shared origin was the basis for their common nature, their possession of rational souls, and their eligibility for the salvation that Christ had made possible. The entire structure of Christian soteriology, the doctrine of how people are saved, depended on the universality of human nature. If some beings looked like people but were not descended from Adam, then they were not fully human in the theologically relevant sense. They were something else, something outside the community of the potentially redeemable. Augustine's answer was careful and revealing. He argued that if such peoples existed, they must be descended from Adam, because all rational creatures shared that descent. God, he reasoned, would not have placed in the world beings that resembled humans closely enough to be confused with them, but that lacked the human soul. He also gently suggested that some of the reports of monstrous peoples might simply be mistaken. Fictions invented by travelers who wanted to seem interesting, or by writers who wanted to fill the edges of their texts with wonder. But he did not dismiss the question as unworthy of serious attention. He reasoned through it with the full force of his considerable intellect, which tells us that by the early 5th century, the Blemmyae had become not merely a geographical curiosity, but a genuine problem for the most sophisticated theological minds of the age. The stakes of this problem become considerably clearer when its practical consequences are followed. The legal and moral frameworks of medieval Christian Europe did not extend equally to all peoples. They extended to Christians, and by theological argument, to all human beings capable of becoming Christians. But the category of the fully human was not infinitely elastic. The question of who counted as fully human, in the sense that mattered for legal and moral purposes, had consequences that went well beyond the realm of theological abstraction. Peoples understood as something less than fully human did not require the same considerations, protections, or moral obligations as peoples who were unambiguously human. A map that placed impossible, half-human figures at the edges of the world was not only a geographical document. It was, whether its creators intended it as such or not, a document about the limits of moral inclusion. It provided a visual framework for thinking about distant peoples as belonging to a different category of being than the peoples at the center. And that framework could be, and was used, to justify the treatment of real people in ways that the theological and legal protections afforded to full humanity would not have permitted. On the Ebsdorf map, a large medieval map created in Germany in the 13th century, and since lost but known through reproductions made before its destruction in the Second World War, the world was depicted within the body of Christ, his head at the eastern top of the image, his hands extending to north and south, his feet at the western bottom. The Blemmyae and other unusual peoples appeared near the outermost ring of the map, near the feet, at the periphery of the divine body. They were, in this rendering, still within the embrace of the sacred, still part of creation. The map included them within the world, even as it marked them as its strangest and most peripheral inhabitants. The tension between that inclusion and that marking, between belonging to the world and being its most extreme exception, runs through the entire history of how these maps imagined the outer edges of human geography. The map was a mirror, and what it reflected, more clearly than any geography, was the shape of what the people who made it needed the world to be. That need, it turned out, was not limited to one tradition, one religion, or one corner of the medieval world. The Arab geographers and a myth that crossed cultures. In the year 1154, a geographer named Muhammad al-Idrisi presented a completed world map to the king of Sicily. The king was Roger II, a Norman ruler who had grown up in the cosmopolitan port city of Palermo, where Arabic, Greek, Latin, and several other languages were spoken in the same markets, where Muslim scholars and Christian clerics worked in buildings that shared the same architectural vocabulary, and where the idea that knowledge belonged to any single tradition was, by the daily evidence of the streets, difficult to sustain. Raja had commissioned Al-Idrisi more than 15 years earlier, asking him to produce the most accurate and complete geographical account of the world that the available knowledge would permit. Al-Idrisi spent those years interviewing travelers, consulting existing maps and texts from multiple traditions, and comparing accounts against each other to find where they agreed and where they diverged. The result was a work of genuine sophistication, a world map engraved on a large silver disc, accompanied by a detailed geographical text that represented one of the most ambitious attempts at accurate cartography produced anywhere in the medieval world. The map was oriented with south at the top, which was conventional in Arabic cartography of the period. If you were to look at it in a museum today, north would appear at the bottom, and the familiar shapes of continents would seem inverted. Africa would loom large at the top of the image. And in the deep interior of that Africa, beyond the coastal regions that Al-Idrisi's sources had reached directly, there would be descriptions of unusual peoples. The Blemmyae were not only a European preoccupation. That would be a simpler story. The more complicated and more instructive reality is that figures very like the Blemmyae appeared in the geographical traditions of the Islamic world as well, which tells us something important about the nature of the myth itself. It was not a product of specifically Christian theology or of specifically European patterns of thought. It was older and more widely distributed than either, rooted in something that seems to be more fundamental than any particular cultural tradition. Muhammad al-Idrisi was an Arab geographer of the 12th century who spent much of his career at the court of Roger II, the Norman king of Sicily. Roger was a ruler of unusual intellectual curiosity, who commissioned Al-Idrisi to produce the most complete and accurate geographical account of the world that the available knowledge would permit. The result, completed around 1154, was a work known as the Tabula Rogeriana, or the Book of Roger, accompanied by a world map that represented one of the most sophisticated geographical documents of the medieval period. Al-Idrisi had access to sources that European mapmakers of his time did not. His position at a cosmopolitan court, where scholars from multiple traditions converged, gave him contact with travelers and merchants from across the Islamic world, which in the 12th century extended from Spain and Morocco through North Africa and the Middle East into Central Asia. His map was more accurate in many respects than its European contemporaries, particularly in its representation of coastlines and the relative positions of major geographical features. He knew things about Africa and Asia that the Hereford Mappa Mundi did not know. And yet, in the deep interior of sub-Saharan Africa, beyond the regions that even the Arab trade networks had penetrated directly, Al-Idrisi placed peoples of unusual description. The Blemmyae by name do not always appear in Arabic geographical texts, but the tradition they represent, the tradition of strange and barely human peoples at the extreme south of Africa, does appear, drawn from the same Greek sources that had fed into the European tradition through different pathways of translation and transmission. Ibn Battuta, the Moroccan traveler of the 14th century, is one of the most remarkable figures in the history of geographical exploration. In the course of a career spanning nearly 3 decades, he traveled through North Africa, the Middle East, Central Asia, India, Southeast Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa, covering a distance that some estimates place at roughly 75,000 miles. He visited the court of the Mali Empire in the 1350s and wrote about it with the specificity and curiosity of a genuine observer, describing the court ceremonies, the city of Mali, the behavior of its merchants and officials, the customs of its people, in a register that is recognizably the writing of someone who was present. And yet, even Ibn Battuta, who had seen more of the world than almost any person alive in his time, continued to use the language of wonder and strangeness for the peoples and places that lay beyond even his extraordinary reach. Not for the people he had himself visited, who he described with the concrete particularity of observed reality, but for those who remained in the regions he had heard about but not reached. The tradition of the monstrous and the extraordinary at the outer edge of knowledge persisted even in the writing of someone whose personal knowledge extended further than that edge had previously been located. It simply moved to accommodate his reach and lodged itself at the next horizon. This is significant because it undermines a simple explanation of the Blemmyae as a product of ignorance that better information would automatically replace. Even in the presence of better information, even in a tradition with more direct geographical knowledge than the European one, the structural need to place something wondrous and strange at the outer edge of the known persisted. The myth served a function that factual knowledge could not replace, because the function it served was not primarily informational. A world with headless peoples at its southern edge was strange, but it had edges that meant something. A world that simply continued beyond the reach of knowledge, with no content at all, offered a different and less manageable kind of discomfort. The mechanism by which classical Greek geographical texts traveled into Arabic scholarship is itself worth a brief pause. From roughly the 8th century onward, scholars working under the patronage of the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad undertook a massive project of translating Greek scientific and philosophical texts into Arabic. Ptolemy's geography was among the most important of these translations. Portions of other Greek geographical writings followed, and with those translations came the inherited content of the classical tradition, including the populations of the outer edges, the strange peoples that Greek geography had placed at the limits of the known world. Those figures did not need to make separate arguments for their inclusion in the Arabic geographical tradition. They arrived with the prestige of classical Greek learning already attached to them, and they settled into the Arabic geographical imagination in roughly the same positions they had occupied in the Greek one. The Blemmyae, in this light, are not a European myth. They are a Mediterranean myth, rooted in a tradition of classical learning that both the Christian European world and the Islamic world inherited from ancient Greece. Their presence in both traditions simultaneously is evidence not of separate inventions, but of a shared ancestor. The same classical texts generating the same figures in two different cultural and linguistic contexts. This shared origin makes their persistence across both traditions easier to understand. They were not a local product that would disappear when local knowledge improved. They were embedded in the foundational texts of learning itself, and they moved wherever those texts moved. But texts alone do not make a myth last 14 centuries. At some point, someone has to choose to give it a story. And in the 14th century, someone did exactly that. From a library he never left, writing a journey he never took. Mandeville and the book that everyone read. Somewhere in France or England in the 1350s, a man is sitting at a writing desk beside a window. Outside, the light is gray. It has been gray for days. The city around him is recovering from a plague that killed, in some places, half the people who lived there. The streets are quieter than they used to be. The market is smaller. There are houses with no one left inside them. The man at the desk is not thinking about any of this. He is thinking about islands, about a warm sea he has read about in a dozen different books, about harbors where the air smells of spices and the water is so clear you can see the bottom from the deck of a ship. He is thinking about a people he has read about who have only one foot, enormous and flat, which they hold above themselves like a parasol when they lie down in the heat of the day. He is thinking about the Blemmyae, their eyes in their shoulders, their mouths in their chests, standing in the interior of a continent he will never visit. He picks up his pen. He begins to write. He writes in the first person, as a man who has been there, who has seen these things, who is reporting them from memory, as a traveler reports from memory when he is finally home and sitting at a desk, and the journey has become something he can hold at the distance of language. He has not been anywhere, but the book he is writing will travel further than he ever could. In the middle of the 14th century, a book appeared in France that would become one of the most widely read texts in all of medieval Europe. It presented itself as the memoir of an English knight named Sir John Mandeville, who described a journey he claimed to have begun in 1322, traveling from England to Jerusalem, and then continuing eastward through the Middle East, Persia, India, and eventually to the islands of the Far East. The book was written in French, the literary language of the educated European elite of the time, and it was quickly translated into Latin, English, German, Italian, Dutch, and several other languages. Counting manuscript copies across all languages, Mandeville's travels survives in more versions from the medieval period than virtually any other secular text. Only the Bible itself was copied more frequently during those centuries. The book described things that no ordinary reader of the 14th century had any reason to expect they would ever see for themselves. Mandeville wrote of a land where the people had only one enormous foot, which they held above themselves as a shade when they lay down to sleep in the midday heat. He wrote of islands whose people had faces like dogs and communicated through barking. He described rivers that ran with precious stones instead of water, and trees that produced fruit in the shape of living lambs, which grazed on the branch before they were ripe. He described the Blemmyae, placing them sometimes on islands in the Indian Ocean and sometimes in the interior of Africa, always with the same description. No head, their eyes set into their shoulders, their mouths curved across their chests, exactly as Pliny had described them more than 1,300 years before. Mandeville wrote all of this in the first person, in the voice of a traveler recounting what he had personally witnessed or had heard from credible sources encountered during his journey. The effect was vividly persuasive. He was not presenting the Blemmyae as a scholarly citation, not attributing them to Pliny or Silenus or any earlier authority. He was presenting them as things he had seen or reliably heard about while traveling in regions where such things were to be expected. That difference in presentation mattered enormously. An authoritative text that listed the Blemmyae among other peoples of Africa was one kind of document. A memoir in which a traveler encountered the Blemmyae and described them from something approaching personal experience was a considerably more vivid and affecting kind. The deepest irony of Mandeville's travels is that virtually all of it was invented, or more precisely, assembled from other sources. Modern scholars who have examined the text with care have traced nearly every detail in it back to earlier written works, to Pliny and Silenus for the monstrous peoples, to actual travel accounts like those of William of Rubruck and Marco Polo for the more credible geographical descriptions, to various natural histories and encyclopedias for the descriptions of exotic animals and plants. The book is, in its essential structure, an anthology of borrowed material presented as personal experience. Mandeville himself, to the extent that the name refers to a real individual rather than a convenient fiction, almost certainly never left Europe. And yet, it worked. It worked not despite the implausibility of its contents, but in part because of it. The world Mandeville described was strange enough to be wondrous and ordered enough to be believable. The Blemmyae appeared in it, not as inherited scholarly baggage, but as living people the narrator had encountered or heard about at close range, their existence confirmed by the very fact that a reasonable man was reporting it in a reasonable tone. The shift from third-person authority to first-person witness is a powerful rhetorical move, and Mandeville, or whoever wrote under that name, understood it intuitively. What the extraordinary popularity of Mandeville's travels reveals is not the credulity of medieval readers. It reveals something about the relationship between narrative and belief. A story told well, in the right voice, in a form that matches what the audience already half expects to be true, does not require literal accuracy to be convincing. The Blemmyae had been in the European textual tradition for more than 1,000 years before Mandeville wrote. They were already part of the furniture of the educated imagination. Mandeville gave them a story, a setting, a voice, a context that made them feel encountered rather than merely inherited. And that was what his readers wanted. Not information they could not otherwise obtain, but confirmation of a world they already believed to exist beyond the edges of their own experience. Portuguese ships and the myth that moved. Somewhere off the coast of what is now Guinea, sometime in the 1460s, a Portuguese ship is moving south. The crew has been at sea long enough that the coast they left behind has a name on their chart, but the coast ahead does not. The chart they are using was made in Lisbon, compiled from the reports of earlier voyages, and it shows, with reasonable accuracy, the coastline they have already passed. Further south, the lines become less certain. The coastline suggested on the chart is partly a guess, partly an inheritance from older maps, and partly blank. In the interior of the continent, beyond the coast that has been confirmed by previous expeditions, there are marks that have been on African maps for centuries. Among them, in the region the chart labels in the language of inherited classical geography, are the Blemmyae. The sailors know the marks are there. Some of them have been trained to read charts. Others navigate by experience and by the instructions of the pilot. None of them expect to find what the marks describe, exactly. But none of them would be entirely surprised if the interior held things stranger than they had yet seen. The world, in their experience, is full of things that are stranger than expectation. They will sail further south. They will make contact with peoples along this coast who have never seen a Portuguese ship. They will note the harbors, the currents, the depth of the water at certain points. They will return to Lisbon with information that cartographers will add to the next version of the chart. And the Blemmyae, on that next chart, will still be there. Pushed a little further south, pushed a little deeper into the interior, but still there. The 15th century introduced something that the Blemmyae had never previously encountered: systematic empirical investigation of the regions they were said to inhabit. Beginning in the early decades of the century, the Portuguese crown began funding and organizing a series of expeditions down the western coast of Africa. The motivation was partly commercial, partly strategic, and partly a genuine desire to extend the boundaries of geographical knowledge. Each expedition went further south than the previous one, charting coastlines, making contact with coastal peoples, noting the stars and the currents and the depths. The sailors who made these voyages carried maps on which the Blemmyae were marked, in the interior of the African continent, beyond the coastal regions already known. And as the expeditions reached further south, as they made contact with the peoples of Senegal, of Guinea, of what is now Ghana and Nigeria, and further still, they found, consistently and without exception, nothing that resembled what those marks described. The people they encountered were varied and complex, organized into distinct political communities with their own histories and trade networks and systems of governance. They were sometimes welcoming and sometimes hostile. They were skilled metalworkers, farmers, merchants, warriors. But they were entirely, ordinarily, recognizably human. No one had eyes in their shoulders. No one had a mouth in their chest. And yet, the Blemmyae did not disappear from the maps. They moved. When the coastline of Senegal had been charted in enough detail that the interior could be placed with some confidence on the map, the Blemmyae shifted further south, into the regions not yet directly reached. When the Gulf of Guinea became familiar from Portuguese contact, they retreated again, deeper into the continent, always occupying the territory just beyond where the most recent expedition had gone. This movement was not the result of any conscious decision by any mapmaker. It happened because the maps were being updated in sections, with new coastal information added carefully, while the interiors remained as they had been, filled with inherited content. The Blemmyae were part of that inherited content, and they persisted wherever the parchment or paper had not yet been updated by the addition of new reported knowledge. The pattern this created is one of the more instructive things about the entire Blemmyae tradition. A myth that retreats before advancing knowledge, without ever entirely disappearing, reveals that it is not primarily dependent on the absence of knowledge in any particular location. It is dependent on the existence of edges, on the structural fact that maps always have regions of uncertainty, always have spaces where the inherited and the observed have not yet resolved themselves into settled geographical fact. As long as those spaces exist, there is somewhere for the myth to live. The Blemmyae were not tied to Africa specifically. They were tied to the outer edge of the known, wherever that edge happened to be located at a given moment. The navigational charts, called portolan charts, developed by Italian and Iberian cartographers from the 13th century onward, were more accurate along the coastlines they documented than the symbolic tradition of the Mappa Mundi had ever aspired to be. They were practical instruments, designed for use by working sailors navigating real coastlines in real conditions. A portolan chart of the Mediterranean coast was a document of genuine precision, its compass lines and port names based on accumulated navigational experience rather than theological symbolism or inherited classical description. A sailor who used one to navigate the Adriatic or the Aegean was trusting information that had been tested against reality by thousands of crossings. And even these more utilitarian documents retained, in their interior spaces and in the decorative borders that surrounded their working content, the imagery of strange peoples and unusual creatures. The portolan charts held the practical and the mythological on the same surface without apparent contradiction, because these were not, for their users, contradictory registers. They were different kinds of knowledge, serving different needs, and both were understood to be real. This coexistence is worth pausing on, because it challenges a simple narrative about how medieval and early modern people related to geographical knowledge. The sailors who used portolan charts were not naive about the difference between charted coastlines and the decorated interiors of their maps. They understood, in a practical sense, that the coastal information had been tested and the interior content had not. But that understanding did not lead them to dismiss the interior content as fiction. It led them to hold both kinds of knowledge simultaneously, one for navigation, one for understanding the broader shape of the world, without feeling that one necessarily contradicted the other. The Blemmyae, in the interior of a portolan chart, served the same purpose they served on the Hereford Mappa Mundi. They marked the edge of the practically navigable and the beginning of the unknown. They gave that boundary a form. And as long as the interior of Africa remained genuinely beyond the reach of direct Portuguese contact, The form they gave it was, in its way, as honest as the charted coastline beside it. It was an admission, rendered in the only language available, that beyond this point the world was not yet known, and that the unknown had to be given some shape. And this was the shape that the tradition supplied. Columbus, Raleigh, and a new world for an old myth. When Columbus sailed westward from the Canary Islands in September of 1492, he carried not only navigational instruments and royal letters of introduction, but a set of deeply embedded expectations about what he would find when he reached the lands he was seeking. He had read Mandeville. He was familiar with the classical accounts of monstrous peoples at the edges of the known world. He expected the islands and mainland of Asia, where his calculations suggested he would arrive, to be populated with the range of peoples that the authoritative sources had placed there. Sophisticated civilizations like Cathay and the court of the Great Khan, but also, at the more peripheral edges of those lands, the stranger beings that classical and medieval tradition had placed in the outer zones of the world. When Columbus arrived in the Caribbean and began attempting to communicate with the peoples of the islands, he interpreted what he was told through this pre-existing framework. His journals record that the people of certain islands described to him, through gesture and the imperfect mediation of interpreters who barely shared a language with him, other peoples on nearby islands or on the mainland who had fearsome or unusual qualities. Columbus interpreted some of these accounts as references to people with dog heads, a category of monstrous people well established in the classical tradition. Others he understood as references to people who ate human flesh. Whether the peoples being described actually had those qualities, or whether Columbus was hearing genuine descriptions of neighboring groups filtered through the lens of what he expected to find, and the limitation of mutual incomprehension, is a question that cannot be answered with confidence at this distance. But the direction of the interpretation is clear. The new world was entered with the old myth already active in the mind of the person entering it. It was Sir Walter Raleigh who gave the Blemmyae their most explicit and famous American incarnation. Raleigh led an expedition to the Orinoco region of what is now Venezuela in 1595, driven by the persistent dream of El Dorado, the legendary city of gold that Spanish and English explorers had been pursuing for decades. He did not find El Dorado, but in his account of the expedition, published in 1595 as The Discovery of the Large, Rich, and Beautiful Empire of Guyana, he described being told by indigenous informants of a people living in the interior who had no heads at all. He called this people the Ewaipanoma. He described them with characteristics that were unmistakably those of the Blemmyae. Their eyes set in their shoulders, their mouths in their chests, their hair growing long on their backs. Raleigh was not an uneducated man given to wild fancies. He was a sophisticated courtier, soldier, and writer, one of the most capable and well-connected men of Elizabethan England. His willingness to record the Ewaipanoma in a tone of serious consideration, noting that he had not seen them personally, but that multiple sources had confirmed their existence, tells us something important about the depth to which the expectation of monstrous peoples at the outer edge of the known world had been embedded in the mental landscape of educated Europeans. Even someone of Raleigh's sophistication, working with real informants in a real place, could hear an account of an unfamiliar people and understand it through the framework of the Blemmyae. The framework was so deeply furnished, so thoroughly inhabited, that it shaped the interpretation of new evidence rather than being replaced by it. William Shakespeare, writing Othello in approximately 1603, has his protagonist describe to the Venetian Senate the tales of his travels that had first fascinated Desdemona, tales of strange lands and stranger peoples. Among the wonders Othello recounts are men whose heads do grow beneath their shoulders. The line is delivered without elaboration or explanation, because none was needed. An audience in a London theatre in the early 17th century did not require the Blemmyae to be introduced to them. They already knew what was meant. The reference landed as a reference to something familiar, something that everyone in the room recognized as part of the shared inventory of what the outer world was understood to contain. The Blemmyae had been in the European imagination for so long and so consistently that they had become, in the most literal sense, a figure of speech. There is something worth pausing on here. When the Blemmyae crossed the Atlantic, in the minds of Columbus and Raleigh and Shakespeare's audience, they did not arrive into empty space. They arrived into the same lands where real people lived. Real peoples with names and languages and political structures and histories of their own. The Awaipanoma that Raleigh described as living in the interior of Guyana were placed, in his account, in the same territory occupied by actual indigenous communities he had himself encountered. The myth did not fill a blank. It covered something real. Just as Blemmyae had stood on the old maps of Africa, exactly where Mali and Axum's trading partners should have been, so they now stood in the Americas where the Orinoco peoples were. The map, in each case, was not missing its content. It was replacing it. And the figure it placed there said something not about the land, but about the person holding the pen, and what that person needed the unknown to contain. The people behind the myth, distance, language, and the shape of misunderstanding. Somewhere in sub-Saharan Africa, at some point before the 1st century of the Common Era, something happened that eventually became the Blemmyae. We do not know what it was. We do not know where exactly it happened, or who was involved, or what the original observation looked like before it entered the chain of transmission that would carry it through 1,000 years of copying and retelling. But something was the beginning. Something a person saw, or heard, or misunderstood, or described imperfectly in a language that the listener had to translate, which that listener then passed on in a form slightly different from the one they received, which the next person in the chain altered again until what finally reached Pliny in his villa by the bay was a shape that bore only the most distant relationship to whatever had happened at the origin. Think about what that chain looks like in practice. A trader from a coastal people hears, from a trader who came from further inland, an account of a people who fight in an unusual way. He tries to describe this to a merchant from a different culture who speaks his language imperfectly. The merchant understands something, though not precisely what was meant, and carries that imperfect understanding to a port city where a Greek traveler or geographer picks it up, again through translation, again with some loss and some addition. The Greek writes it down, in compressed form, as a note in a geographical account. A later Greek reads that note and copies it, adding a detail or removing one. A Roman reads the Greek account and incorporates it into a Latin text. The Latin text is copied and copied again, and 5 centuries later, a monk in Northern Europe reads a copy of a copy of a copy of the original Latin, and places on a map a figure with eyes in its shoulders and a mouth across its chest. At no point in that chain was anyone lying. At no point was anyone inventing. Every person in the chain was passing on what they understood they had received. But understanding degrades over distance, and distance, in this case, was measured not only in miles, but in languages and centuries. When something persists in the historical record for more than 1,000 years, appearing in texts from ancient Rome through medieval Europe through the age of exploration, described with remarkable consistency across different languages and different cultural contexts, it invites a question worth taking seriously. Is there anything real at its origin? Not real in the sense that the Blemmyae literally existed as described, because there is no reason to think they did, and every reason to think they did not. But real in the sense that some actual human encounter, some actual observation or account, lies somewhere at the beginning of the chain that eventually produced the headless people of classical and medieval geography. Several possibilities have been seriously proposed by scholars who have thought carefully about this question. One suggestion focuses on combat practices. Some peoples of sub-Saharan Africa used large shields decorated with faces or elaborate visual motifs held before them in battle. An observer, watching such a formation from a distance, or receiving an account of it from someone who had themselves only seen it imperfectly, might describe warriors whose faces appeared to be located in their chests rather than on their heads. This is a plausible enough origin for a misunderstanding, though whether a misunderstanding of this kind could survive enough retellings to reach Pliny in recognizable form is harder to assess. Another suggestion involves body decoration practices. Elaborate chest tattoos, scarification patterns, or body painting covering the torso might have been described by an observer who lacked the vocabulary to explain accurately what they were seeing. And the description might then have been understood as something more extreme than was intended. A traveler from a culture without elaborate body decoration who encountered a people for whom such decoration was significant and visually striking might describe it in terms that, once stripped of context and passed through translation, became something that looked more like a displaced face than like art on a chest. A third possibility, and perhaps the most likely, is that the Blemmyae did not begin with any direct observation at all, but with the misreading of a text. Ancient Greek geographical writing was full of condensed and sometimes ambiguous descriptions of distant peoples. A passage that was intended metaphorically, or that described some cultural practice in compressed form, using terms that were ordinary in Greek but difficult to translate accurately, might have been read literally by a later compiler working in a different language and a different context. Once the literal reading entered the authoritative record, the weight of that record prevented any subsequent reader from questioning it. It had been there too long to be a mistake. What all of these possibilities share is a common underlying structure. Something, however small and however distant from the Blemmyae of Pliny's encyclopedia, passed through a series of transformations and emerged on the other side in a shape its origin would not have recognized. And crucially, the shape it emerged in was not random. It conformed to what the receiving tradition needed and expected to find at the outer edge of the world. The blank spaces on the map were not neutral. They had a gravitational pull toward a particular kind of content, and the Blemmyae provided exactly that content in exactly the right form. Of the three possibilities, the third, that the Blemmyae began not with observation, but with the misreading of an older text, is perhaps the most persuasive. Not because it is the most dramatic, but because it is the most consistent with how classical geographical writing actually worked. Greek geographical texts were often compressed, elusive, and difficult to interpret accurately in translation. A passage that made sense in its original context could mean something quite different when read by someone 2 languages and 5 centuries removed from it. And once a literal reading entered an authoritative text, it was effectively immune to correction, because correction would require questioning the authority itself, which almost no one was willing to do. The misreading hypothesis does not require anyone to have behaved unusually. It only requires the ordinary processes of transmission and translation to have done what they always do: introduce small errors that compound over time into large ones. The shield hypothesis and the body decoration hypothesis are both plausible as origins, but they face a practical problem. For either of them to have generated the specific Blemmyae description, the misunderstanding would have had to travel a very long way, through many intermediaries, and remain stable enough in its core details to be recognizable when it finally arrived in Greek geographical writing. That is possible, but it is a longer chain than the misreading hypothesis requires. What none of these hypotheses can fully explain, and what is perhaps the most important thing the Blemmyae offer, is why the shape survived. Not how it began, but why, once it existed, it persisted for 14 centuries without serious challenge. The answer to that question does not lie in the origin. It lies in the need that the shape fulfilled at every point along the chain, for everyone who encountered it and passed it on. This is perhaps the most instructive insight that the entire Blemmyae tradition offers. It demonstrates how expectation operates on evidence, particularly thin evidence, in a way that is not specific to the medieval world or to any particular culture or period. When the evidence for something is weak and the expectation of finding it is strong, the evidence tends to be shaped by the expectation, rather than the expectation being corrected by the evidence. The account of a strange people in a distant region will be interpreted through the framework of what strange people in distant regions are expected to look like. The framework shapes the interpretation. This is not a failure of reason. It is a feature of how minds process uncertainty, and it operates across every period of history, including the present one. The Renaissance map and the slow retreat. In Antwerp in the year 1570, a man named Abraham Ortelius is overseeing the final preparation of a book that will change how Europe understands its own geography. The book is called the Theatrum Orbis Terrarum, the Theater of the World, and it is the first time that a collection of standardized maps of the known world has been assembled into a single bound volume and made available for purchase. The maps inside it were drawn by Ortelius and by cartographers he trusted, using the best sources available to him. He has spent years comparing accounts, noting where they agree and where they conflict, trying to separate what has been observed from what has been inherited. He is working at a large table covered in paper. The printing press in the next room is ready. The copper plates have been engraved. In a few weeks, the first copies will be bound and sent to buyers across Europe. Merchants, scholars, nobles, and curious readers of modest means will hold in their hands something that has never quite existed before. A systematic picture of the world as it is now understood, updated to reflect the explorations of the previous century. Turn to the section on Africa in that book. The coastline is drawn with reasonable accuracy along the west and the north, reflecting decades of Portuguese charting. The interior is sparser, less certain, the lines suggesting geography rather than confirming it. And in that interior, the Blemmyae are not there. Not in the main body of the maps, not labeled, not illustrated. After more than 14 centuries of appearing on maps of Africa without question, they are simply gone from this one, replaced by open space and uncertainty. No announcement was made. No correction was issued. They simply did not make it into the Theatrum Orbis Terrarum, and that absence, quiet and unexplained, was the beginning of their end. The 16th century brought printing to geography, and printing changed the distribution and character of geographical knowledge in ways that affected the Blemmyae directly. Before printing, maps and geographical texts were reproduced by hand, each copy an individual object, produced by an individual scribe, varying slightly from its exemplar in ways both deliberate and accidental. After printing, the same image could be reproduced in identical form in hundreds or thousands of copies, distributed across the continent within weeks of publication, consulted by readers in Germany and Spain and England simultaneously. The economics of the map trade changed, the speed of the trade changed, and the nature of what was authoritative about a map began to shift. The great names of 16th century cartography, Gerardus Mercator in Flanders, Abraham Ortelius in Antwerp, Sebastian Münster in Basel, were working with better information than their predecessors had possessed. The decades of Portuguese exploration along the African coast had produced detailed coastal surveys. The Spanish voyages to the Americas had produced an increasingly specific picture of the continents to the west. The knowledge available to a cartographer working in 1570 was considerably richer and more reliable than the knowledge available to the monk who had drawn the Hereford Mappa Mundi 2.5 centuries earlier. And the Blemmyae began, slowly, to disappear from the maps. Not all at once, not cleanly, not with any announcement or ceremony. The process was gradual and uneven, varying from mapmaker to mapmaker and from region to region. Some of the great printed atlases of the 16th century retained strange peoples in the interiors of Africa and South America, either because the compiler genuinely trusted the older sources or because the interior of a continent, which direct exploration had not yet penetrated in a way that produced reliable cartographic information, still had space for the inherited shapes. Others quietly omitted them, replacing the figures of monstrous peoples with animals, with trees, with decorative compass roses, or simply with open space. The decision was rarely commented upon. The Blemmyae were not formally retired. They faded, region by region, without fanfare. Abraham Ortelius's Theatrum Orbis Terrarum, published in 1570, and often described as the first modern atlas in the sense of a bound collection of standardized maps produced from the best available sources, was more rigorous in its use of sources than most of its predecessors. Ortelius was careful and systematic. He consulted widely, noted his sources, and tried to distinguish between reliable and unreliable geographical information. The Blemmyae do not appear in the main body of his work, but even Ortelius, in the sections of his accompanying text that dealt with distant regions where direct knowledge was limited, retained language that reflected the inherited tradition of the wonderful and the strange at the edges of the known world. Sebastian Münster's Cosmographia, published in 1544 and reprinted dozens of times over the following decades in multiple languages, was a more popular and less rigorous document. It combined genuinely reported regional geography with material drawn from the classical and medieval tradition, and it retained, in its sections on distant lands, accounts of unusual peoples that would have been recognized immediately by any reader of Pliny or Mandeville. Münster was not a credulous man. He was a serious scholar, but he was working within a tradition that had not yet fully established the principle that inherited authority must yield to reported observation, and his willingness to include both kinds of material side by side, without distinguishing between them, reflects the genuine complexity of what knowledge meant in the early period of print. The retreat of the Blemmyae from European maps was not a moment of enlightenment. It was a negotiation, conducted in silence, map by map, edition by edition, with no announcement and no apology. The people who had believed in them were never told they were wrong. The maps simply changed around them, and the figures that had stood at the edge of the world for 14 centuries faded out, not with a correction, but with a blank space that no one felt the need to explain. The parchment folds, but the edge remains. We have traveled a long way through this tonight. From the Hereford Mappa Mundi and its cathedral in England, to the scriptoria of medieval monasteries where monks copied Pliny and Silenus and Isidore without question, to the court of Roger II in Sicily where Al-Idrisi drew his sophisticated and still mistaken map, to Mandeville writing his imaginary travels in a library somewhere in France, to the Portuguese ships moving steadily down the African coast, to the journals of Columbus and the published account of Raleigh's Orinoco expedition, to the London theatre, where Shakespeare's audience heard about men whose heads grow beneath their shoulders and needed no explanation. The Blemmyae have been with us throughout, shifting position, changing names, moving from one uncertain margin of the map to another, always just beyond where the most recent expedition had gone, persistent in a way that speaks to something more fundamental than any particular geographical misconception. They are gone from our maps now. There are no headless peoples marked in the interior of Africa on any map produced in the last several centuries. The spaces they once occupied have been entered, explored, photographed from the air, and mapped in detail that would have been unimaginable to the monk who first inked their figures onto calfskin by the light of a lamp burning in a cold room in the medieval north. The geography of the world, at least the geography of its surface, is now known in an extent and a precision that leaves no room for figures of the kind the Blemmyae represented. And yet, the question the Blemmyae were invented to answer has not gone away. It cannot go away, because the edge of what is known is not a geographical feature. It is a structural feature of the human situation. It moves as knowledge moves, and it is always there, because knowledge never reaches everywhere. When the coasts of Africa were charted, the edge shifted to the interior. When the interior was gradually explored and described, the edge shifted to the deep ocean. As oceanographic technology has extended knowledge of the ocean floor, the edge has shifted to the upper atmosphere, to the outer planets, to the regions of space beyond what current instruments can resolve. There is always somewhere that has not yet been seen clearly, and there is always, in the imagination of people living at any given moment, something to be put there. Today, that something takes forms that are recognizably different from the Blemmyae, but structurally similar in the role they play. The deep ocean, of which only a small fraction has been mapped in any detail, is understood in popular imagination to harbor creatures of significant size and strangeness. The universe beyond the reach of current observational technology is populated, in serious scientific discussion and in popular culture alike, with a range of possibilities that no one can confirm or dismiss. In specific remote places, in forests and mountains that outside observers have not extensively explored, the possibility of large animals not yet identified by science surfaces periodically in accounts that bear a familiar shape. Reported by credible people who heard from other credible people, consistent enough in outline to be taken seriously, resistant to the kind of definitive answer that would settle the question for good. The names change, the places change, the edge moves. But the act of standing at the limit of what is known and reaching forward to give the darkness a face, that has not changed at all. Somewhere tonight, in a library or a museum storage room or a digitized archive, a piece of parchment holds the image of a figure with eyes in its shoulders and a mouth curved across its chest. The figure was drawn by someone who sat in a cold room by lamplight, with a quill and a pot of ink, and a tradition stretching back 8 centuries behind them, and who did what people have always done when the map runs out. They drew something. Not because they knew what was there, but because not knowing and leaving it blank was harder to bear than drawing a figure that was wrong. That figure is wrong about the world, but it is not wrong about the person who drew it. And perhaps, if we are honest, it is not entirely wrong about us either. If these slow journeys through the edges of what people have known and imagined are the kind of thing you find restful, you are very welcome to stay. There is always more to follow when you move slowly enough to see where one thing leads to the next. Sleep well tonight.